Hello, everyone. This video will be walking you through a little bit of my research that I've done for my capstone project and walking you through the creative element, which is programming and making a creative element of in contact, which is making the sample library. So the capstone project that I did was researching instrument sampling. I was taking composition 2 a few years ago, and one of the projects that we did for that class was writing a film score for one of the CART capstone projects. And this capstone project is kind of tied back to that because once I started taking that class and doing that project, I realized how much I love doing composition for film, and not just for film, but also for TV media too. Um, One of the tools, and not just a tool, but a skill that is essential for composing for media, is basically using sample libraries. Sample library is the definition of being taking instruments and recording them and then programming them into software so that you can play them back through a DAW. You can put them in. You can put the plugin on a track, put the plugin on an instrument track, and then play them back on a MIDI keyboard. So a lot of the sounds that I loved using are orchestral sounds. And for my capstone project, I wanted to do that because that is kind of a skill that a film composer needs to do. And so I wanted to make my own library for my capstone project. And I love doing this project specifically because it's not just going to be something that I can present to you today, but it's something that I'm going to be using for my compositional career. I am looking at graduate programs in film composition and composing for media. And so I wanted to make a tool that I can use later on in my career. So the library that I made was a library of sound effects, basically a Foley sounds. Foley artistry is the art of making sound effects for films. And so I took about 25 different sound effects from around my house, and I recorded them and then plugged them into Contact to make my own sample library. The way that I pretty much broke down as far as organization goes, I broke them down into two categories. I have unpitched sounds and pitched sounds. The reason why I say pitched and unpitched is because there are some sounds, granted, there's only one specific frequency that you can hit, that you hear from a sound, because there's only one way you can hit it for the most part. But the key is when you're plugging these sounds in, you can stretch them across different frequencies, and sometimes it sounds good, sometimes it doesn't. So there's some sounds where I could stretch them and it actually can sound musical. It can sound more like a musical instrument. So these sounds are not necessarily Foley sounds, but they are good even for musical sounds. You can use them as a melody or something. But these unpitched sounds, you can't, I mean, you have the ability to stretch them, but will they sound musical? Probably not. So that's why I kept them just on one note. So I broke them down to pitched and unpitched. Before even going really into the explanations of all of the programming and the putting in all the samples, just for the recording, I recorded everything with 4 dynamics, because if you record everything at 1 dynamic, then you don't really get the response that you need. Because obviously, if you press a note softer on a keyboard, you expect to hear a quieter note, and vice versa. You press the note harder, you should expect to hear a louder note for any instrument. And so that is why on this library here, you can see that there's these little gaps here. So this section down here, this pianissimo, these are the quietest samples, and then working all the way up to fortissimo, which are the loudest samples. So I recorded everything 4 dynamics, 4 separate hits, 1 dynamic each. There are some libraries, for example, the Spitfire Audio, which is an audio company based in London, England. I own their BBC Symphony Orchestra professional library. I bought that a couple months ago, and there are so many different factors that goes into sampling. Pitch is one of them, but then there's also dynamics. There's also various articulations, basically different ways you can play the instrument. There's round robins, which is recording the same note, the same combination of effects. So basically, you can record one note, a long note at this pitch with this dynamic, but you record it multiple times, because humans are not perfect, so they record the note, they play the note differently every time. So to get that that humanness into the library, you record it several times over. In the Spitfire Audio BBC SO, they have 6 to 8 round robins, and that's the term we use for giving that sampling of recording the same notes over and over. But there are so many different factors that go into just your number of samples. Like I said, there's the pitch, you have articulations, you have dynamics. Big thing for me in my research was microphone placements. Microphone placements change the timbre of the instrument dramatically. You can have a sound that is more intimate, or you can have a sound that is more in the sides of the room, and you can get more of the space of the room rather than a very direct sound of the instrument. It depends what you want to do for your project, and that's why it's important to get that control into the library. So many different factors go into doing that. I kept it very simple. I have only one microphone, and for most of these sounds, there's one articulation, but there were some sounds where I could record multiple. For example, I have a wine glass. I recorded a pen tap. I recorded a finger tap. And then where you rub your finger on the rim and you get that kind of that ghostly sound. But it's you see it with street performance. You see them having different pitches of a different amounts of water, and that changes the pitch. So I recorded that sound too. So even with different objects, there are many different things, different articulations that I could have recorded. But every articulation, I did my best to record 4 different volumes, different dynamics. And after I recorded all of those instruments, the next step was to do noise reduction. After recording, going into the mixing, there is a certain amount of noise that you will hear from the noise floor, which even with, given microphones, given your recording environment, there is a level of noise that when you play one note, you're not really going to hear it that much. But when you play multiple notes, that's where the noise builds up. So you have to do the noise reduction in order to eliminate that noise floor, because that's not something you want to hear in the library. So I put the noise floor on all the samples. The plugin that I use is this Isotope RX8, which this is a really helpful, mostly because of the interface, where it actually listens to the sample, and then it separates out what is the note that you want to hear, or the sound that you want to hear, versus the noise floor. So it helps take out the external noise. This is, of course, a starting point. You should always trust your ears when you're doing this. So I started it, adjust the settings, and then I go in again with my ears, and I trust my ears on this. Once I did that, I export all the samples, and when I'm exporting it, there is an important step into doing this, which is, you name the sample. So this would have been a footstep, and then I put the dynamics in, because it's actually going to look for 2 things. It's going to look for the dynamics, and so if I do pianissimo, I can do messo forte, I can do fortissimo. It looks for dynamics. But there is also another thing when you're doing, of course, this is a Foley library, so I just have one pitch, so I'm not necessarily naming it this way. But for example, if we were to record like a string section, if we want to record first violins, you would want to put in the name of the note, whatever pitch it is, because the Kontakt will look for that. So the bouncing and both exporting and labeling the samples was incredibly important for organizational purposes, because it'll make it much easier to import the samples into your library. Going through a couple of the sounds that I've recorded, a lot of these were a lot of hits, mostly to give almost like an impromptu drum library. But then I wanted to keep with, of course, the essence of Foley artistry, which is classic sound effects. So for example, there's this footstep sound, which classics like horror movie sound effect. So that classic footstep sound is a door slam. And then a couple of my favorite ones up here is actually is this knife sharpening sound. Whoops, that's an octave. There we go. This knife sharpening sound sounds like from an Alfred Hitchcock movie. And then this other sound that I have here is actually from a coconut, which coconut is probably one of the most classic sounds you could have put in for a Foley artist sound. But I actually recorded several different sounds from here. Even before you break open the coconut, you have the liquid that's inside, which is the coconut milk. And so I recorded the shaking of the coconut. It's actually interesting when you shake a coconut hard enough, it changes the timbre of it. It's not just a slush, it's more of a whack against the side of it, which is why it sounds different from, these bottom three layers. And then when you press it really loudly, because when you shake it, it's more of a slap against the side of the coconut. And then recorded actually the constant shaking, which is like a tremolo sound. And that's constantly shaking the coconut. And any sound that was like a tremolo like sound or a roll, I actually went in with the wave editor. And this, I basically have it on a loop because these sounds you could figuratively play for an infinite amount of time. So this is where the loop comes in to keep it constantly going. Couple other unpitched sounds here. Go away from the wave editor. There's this, I mentioned earlier, this wine glass up here. Where is it? Here we go. That wine glass tap. So there's a bunch of classic sound effects, including a couple alternative sounds here. That's a glass jar. A couple other different sound effects, but I wanted to break in and take a look at some of these pitch sounds that I have. These were sounds that I recorded one sound and I stretched them out. And these are the ones that sound a bit more musical, that still work pretty nicely as pitched instruments. So I recorded a PVC pipe, and this one I think sounds pretty good. So I really like that PVC sound effect. There is a tap, which is this wine glass tap, which is tapping with my finger. So I really like that sound. And then another group here, which is a wine bottle opening. And so the cork, this is the popping out of the cork. So I really like it. Kind of has a little bassy sound. It kind of sounds like a didgeridoo, which is really cool. My favorite sound on here is this wine glass, but this is the rim where you get your finger wet and you rub the top of the rim, like I said earlier. And this is where you get that really glassy kind of sound. And this sounds really cool. So that's all one sample of rubbing my finger on the rim and then stretching it out. And this is one that I really like. This is probably my favorite sound that I've recorded down here. As far as the user interface goes, this is all with the scripting. The reason why I picked Contact specifically is because you can write your own code and tailor the user interface however you like. And here's all the code. This is basically make the user interface, so just basically just put a graphic there, and then putting in the reverb, which is all, this is all the code for the reverb here. And then this is what I used for basically putting in all of the different, controlling the volume of all of the different groupings. So you can see my group editor, I have all these different groups for my pitch sounds and then my unpitched sounds. And so all of that is going here. So this is where I can control the volume of each. This is also what I used for finding mic positions. If you want to control the volume of mic positions in an orchestra library or a classical instrument, this is what we would use. And then also putting that in with reverb. I put a convolution reverb in this library and then routed it to this dial here. So it sounds really good with the reverb there. I kept the size of the preset on a small room because what instruments I'm playing, it's not like I'm playing a grand piano where it needs a big space. This can use a little bit smaller space. So that is a brief overview of the library, kind of what goes into making it, what I did to record it, what I did to program it, and then write the scripting. And with Foley artistry, you can make an infinite amount of sound effects. So there are probably a lot more sound effects that I'm going to put into this library eventually. As I find more, I'll keep recording them and plugging them in. But that is a brief overview of my library and how I went about recording it.